All right. This is kind of the last lecture in our build-up towards the War of 1812. And I know you guys have had quite a bit to listen to this week. And I'm trying to go very quickly and really only hit the high points. Mostly because if you don't understand these parts, this idea of the early republic, this idea of the expansion of slavery, this idea of the expansion of the economic system, as well as the American position within the global system, then somehow the Civil War seems like a disconnected being, like it happens and it doesn't really make sense how it has this ripple effect throughout the world. And, for those of you that are not big history buffs, maybe that's, you're like, that's fine. I don't really care. But my perspective as a historian is that you have to see how the dots connect. Because the reality is, we still live in the world that's, where dots connect, where what happens in one country affects another country, and where we're constantly asking these questions about what do we want to do with foreign entanglements? And having a context for how the history develops in this kind of thing, particularly when you're thinking about the War of 1812 and the immediate after effects. When we get to the progressive era and talk about Teddy Roosevelt, a lot of this stuff will be very important. Some of you, of course, we had kind of a weird week this week with band being gone and the PSAT affecting a couple of my classes. So many of you kind of did our kind of early Republic documents activity, and there should have been kind of this examination of Washington's farewell address. Ideally we would have a little more time to camp out with that. But in a nutshell, Washington leaves office. When he left office, he basically exhorted the country to avoid foreign entanglements. Of course, if you think back to the previous lecture, one of the things that happens is this division within the country between people that were pro-French and pro-British, and that you have individuals who felt that the United States should completely support France in the French Revolution and not let Britain kind of, treat him like a wayward little brother. And then there are people that, maybe don't like what Britain's doing as far as impressing soldiers and, boarding ships and that kind of thing. But they also, don't want to support France, and they don't want to cut off the business ties. And remember the connection of business, right? The connection of trade. This goes back to the colonial period. And the fact that trade and this relationship with Great Britain was crucial to the success of the colonies. And while we do have this whole argument during the Revolution over, how much do you get to boss me around, fundamentally the United States still needs Great Britain. And so Washington, whether it's under Hamilton's influence or whether, maybe he was just prescient and he understands more about what the future holds. Who knows, right? He gives this warning to avoid foreign entanglements. He also, interestingly, gives a warning to avoid political factions as well, that factions lead to bad news. Of course, part of that's coming from his understanding of the French Revolution. Kind of keep that in mind. But he does warn us to avoid foreign entanglements. Adams has been president. Adams is kind of, they gets kind of frustrated with France. Of course, Adams was never very pro-French to begin with. And you see him really kind of having that quasi-war, having an undeclared war with France where we're seizing French ships. And he's kind of behaving in a way, he uses the Alien and Sedition Acts to limit French immigration, to control, how people complain about his government and his administration and the things that they're doing that are pro-British. And really people get pretty put out with him. The Alien and Sedition Acts really kind of offend people in their sense of democracy, their sense of what government should do. To many people, the Alien and Sedition Acts are an example of what too much federal government can do. And so there's a real rejection of the Federalists and John Adams and all that they stand for. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're rejecting the alliance with England or the relationship with England, but it does mean that they're not sure that they want to enforce it the way that Adams is wanting to enforce it. So you come into 1800, and I mentioned before, this is called the Revolution of 1800. You have a complete change in political faction, complete new group of people in charge, and this is very telling, right? And one of the issues that will happen here is, we're going to look at the role of the Supreme Court and how that kind of shapes up. But before we get to that, we're going to have to talk about Jefferson. And Jefferson comes in, and he's representing the Democratic Republican ideas and the notion that you don't want the federal government to be too powerful. Kind of this, we don't want Great Britain to push us around. I'm not sure. I mean, the business interests clearly are holding sway, and Jefferson's not able to totally turn his back on Great Britain. But certainly the Democrat-Republican agenda is very important. And I will try to share with you that political party handout. But essentially, it goes over what I talked about with the Federalists and the Democrat-Republicans, and some of the key differences that shape American politics of the 1800s. This idea of, agrarian versus urban, this idea of, manufacturing versus farming, the idea about what the Bank of the United States is supposed to do, this idea about the interpretation of the Constitution. Do we interpret it loosely? Do we interpret it strictly? That kind of thing. And it's into this that we have really the notion of kind of the common man. The Democrat-Republicans are huge supporters of what we call the ordinary citizen and their ability to influence politics. And so this is what we refer to as Jeffersonian democracy. So if you hear somebody ever talk about, oh, he's very Jeffersonian, which, you probably won't hear all that often unless you run in really history geeky circles. But Jeffersonians are going to tend to favor the ordinary citizen, the middle class, the kind of populism, if you will, that the will of the people will manifest itself, and the people always know best. And if we we can trust the citizens to make the best decisions. So we'll see very quickly that he will undo Federalist policies. The whiskey tax that had triggered the Whiskey Rebellion, they do away with that. Which makes farmers happy. Of course, he's, if you're a Jeffersonian and you want to please the agrarian element, you're obviously going to do that. They're going to just kind of let the Alien and Sedition Acts expire. They're not going to re-up them. And you see Jefferson makes a huge slash in the federal budget, particularly tries to really cut the size of the government. And you can see that, eventually this will create some issues, and we'll get to that a little bit more. But yeah, Jefferson totally, he tries to make the government as small as possible. One of the documents that, in kind of those of you that did the documents of the early republic, we looked at the role of Marbury v. Madison. Marbury v. Madison, in a nutshell, and I'll try to go through it very quickly, is really the decision where the Supreme Court, led by Justice John Marshall, who basically they set up this system by which the Supreme Court does not enforce laws, but rather the Supreme Court interprets laws. The details of Marbury v. Madison, you can read them right here. There's nothing really unique about it, although you do kind of have this notion of John Adams trying to stack as many government positions as possible with Federalists, not with Democrat Republicans. And so he's kind of trying to do this kind of at the last minute before he leaves office. And so when James Madison comes in and he's like, no, I don't want these Federalists in charge because their decisions will shape policy, right? They'll set these precedents, and he refuses to do that. Well, this leads to, Marbury taking him to court, and this is where we get the name Marbury v. Madison. And so Justice John Marshall is a Federalist. So he's going to be an advocate for a strong central government. He's going to be an advocate, for being able to use the government in new ways and having a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Now, here's the problem with John Marshall. Of course, know that, the Supreme Court justices are appointed for life. And so, it's not like he's worried that he's going to lose his job. But you clearly, with the election of 1800, have this shift of the country away from that hardline Federalist agenda. And so he knows if he rules, I mean, he doesn't want to upset Federalists and say, oh, well, Marbury doesn't deserve his appointment, right? Because as a Federalist, he wants Marbury to have the appointment. But then again, he's also looking at, he's looking at if he comes out and says, no, you have to give him the job, then he's going to alienate the Democrat Republicans, and it's going to have a ripple effect through all other areas of politics. And so he doesn't want to make a bunch of political enemies. And so Marshall really kind of navigates his way through a political minefield on this one. And you can see here, like just by looking at the thing, that Marbury does indeed deserve his ruling, that it's incorrect for Madison not to give him his position. However, he basically goes a step further and says, however, the Supreme Court can't do anything about it. Right? The Judiciary Act of 1789 doesn't work completely. That you can't essentially you can't, the Supreme Court can't force the government to do anything. All we can do is evaluate a law. And our evaluation of this is that Marbury should indeed have his position, but hey, there's nothing we can do about it. And so this establishes the notion that the Supreme Court rather, reviews laws and determines if they're legal or not. Now, the Supreme Court does not enforce them, ever, 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 ever. However, right, the executive branch, the president, is supposed to enforce the Constitution. So if the Supreme Court comes down and says this is the law, then the president is supposed to enforce it. It is up to the legislative branch, Congress, if they don't like the ruling that the Supreme Court says, they can go back and try to amend the Constitution, they can redo the law, they can do several other things. But essentially, even the legislative branch doesn't necessarily enforce the law. Only the executive branch does. And so you see the Supreme Court positioning itself as a check on the congressional power and really a check on the common man, if you think about it. Because if you think about decisions, this becomes particularly powerful if you're talking about segregation, if you're talking about limiting rights for people, if you're talking about those individual freedoms that people have. When Congress passes laws that restrict those, the Supreme Court can say you can't do that. Of course, they can also say, yes, you can, right? They can say, no, this falls within the Constitution. So that knife cuts both ways, but I think it's very important for you to understand that it's Marbury v. Madison that is the cause for this. Every now and then this will pop up into a test, or, who knows if on an SAT test they ask you a question about the background of the Supreme Court, and knowing that it's this particular case that establishes judicial review is very important. Next major thing that we see happening here is Louisiana Purchase. Of course, there's a global context here in that the French Revolution, of course, Napoleon tries to claim world power, world domination, essentially. Well, world domination is a little strong. He wants to control Europe, essentially, and he does kind of have a vision for controlling more of the Caribbean. It's when Napoleon's around that you kind of have this brief period where France kind of controls Mexico, and so you kind of have France being heavily involved in the Caribbean until, of course, you have the Haitian Revolution. Haiti actually declares independence. They kick out the sugar planters, and it becomes a country of former slaves. And what we'll see is that when France loses Haiti and Napoleon decides, you know what, I'm not going to try to get that back. I'm going to focus on securing my power in Europe and in the Mediterranean area. When he decides to do that, he has no reason to keep any territory in North America. In other words, it's like, why do you want to have someplace that you have to take care of that's way far out of the way? And so essentially, he doesn't need to have North America anymore. And on top of that, he needs money to fight his wars in Europe. Well, we've mentioned before that the United States really wanted New Orleans and the Mississippi River. And so Jefferson basically reaches out to Napoleon and says, hey, we would like to have specific access to the Mississippi River. What can we negotiate? That kind of thing. And basically, he gets completely shocked by the fact Napoleon's like, you know what? I don't even want that territory anymore. I'll sell you all of Louisiana for $15 million. Okay. Now, if you think back to the Treaty of Paris of 1783, France had, while France ceded the territory to the east of the Mississippi River, they had the territory to the west of it. So this is all that territory that goes from what is now Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, some into Kansas, Nebraska, all that area. Of course, now they don't even know exactly how much is there, right? I mean, you're talking, this is not a well-defined territory. And so basically, I mean, Napoleon will one-up Jefferson and completely shock Livingston and Monroe and say, you know what, I don't want any of it. And so how about you buy it for $15 million? And Jefferson, who totally believes in the power of that small agrarian society, that common man, that the yeoman farmer or the small business owner or something like that, those kinds of ideas, right? He totally believes in this. So for him, he says, hey, this is, more territory, more land for, yeoman farmers, access to the Mississippi River, which will help the yeoman farm. He sees this huge expansion of that common man possibility. Really kind of almost a utopian society is really part of what his vision is. And what's so funny about this is that, Livingston and Monroe don't have the authorization to do this, right? Typically Congress should approve any treaties like this. Congress should be approving major expenditures and all that kind of stuff. And so, here's Jefferson, Mr. Democrat Republican. I'm a strict constructionist. I don't really like the bank. I'm really comfortable with the notion of a strong central bank. I'd much rather have individual state banks. This same guy will turn around and then use the Bank of the United States to finance his purchase of the Louisiana Territory. And this is a map that shows you right here the Louisiana Purchase. Now you can see based on this map that the pink area, that Spain tried to say, oh, well, you weren't really buying all of that. You were just buying this little bitty area. Napoleon isn't really particularly specific over what he's selling. The United States says, oh, we're taking all of this, right? So you've got very loose definitions of what this territory is, but this kind of gives you a mental map of what it looks like, how the U.S. gets control of New Orleans. It also shows you some of the major explorations, Lewis and Clark, that go all the way to the Pacific Ocean, really outside of what is the Louisiana Territory. Pike and his travels through the Southwest. So that kind of gives you an idea for what that looks like. So Jefferson uses the Bank of the United States to fund this purchase, right? And he basically does this like without permission from Congress, like, hey, this opportunity's here, we're going to take it. So you would think, like on the surface, first off, very hypocritical of Jefferson. Here he had complained about the Bank of the United States, supported state banks, criticized loose interpretations of the Constitution and loose applications of executive power, vis-a-vis John Adams and the Alien Sedition Acts, right? So he's very critical of those things until, of course, it suits his purpose for the Louisiana Purchase. And, oh, hey, we're going to create all these yeoman farmers and everyone's going to be so happy and the United States is going to be this, agrarian society. And so, when it suits his need, he certainly takes advantage of the Bank of the United States to finance this purchase. Now, there's not a whole lot of griping about this, even though clearly he's playing a little fast and loose with some concepts about how what authority the president has and how the Bank of the United States functions, and he's doing some funny business, but most people don't care, right? I mean, if you're a Democrat, Republican, you love the idea of getting all this territory for expansion. If you're a Federalist, you really love the idea of land speculation, right? Because now people are going to get to make money. The idea of controlling New Orleans and the Mississippi River is highly attractive. So really nobody questions this too much. But I just think it's interesting for you to see that Jefferson, another example of how he says one thing and does another, kind of like his ability to own slaves and have a slave mistress, all while he's writing the Declaration of, he doesn't have a slave mistress while he writes the Declaration of Independence, but shortly after he writes the Declaration of Independence. So you definitely see Jefferson really taking advantage of the systems that Hamilton had put in place. We had the Lewis and Clark expedition. I didn't really go into a whole lot of detail about that. Now, I mean, it is fascinating. It's certainly an area of extensive study. People that love frontier stories really love the Lewis and Clark expedition, but we just don't really have time to go into a whole lot of detail. But know that it happens, that it's Meriwether Lewis and whatever Clark's first name is, and they certainly kind of step out of a comfort zone, and Sacagawea helps them navigate their way through this territory. And really, in a lot of ways, this mission was kind of top secret. Jefferson's very, very quiet about kind of having these two guys go on this expedition because he doesn't know what he's going to find, right? And he doesn't want to trigger a mass land grab. He doesn't want to trigger problems with Britain or France or anything like that. So you've got lots of reasons why he kind of keeps it hush-hush. And so Lewis and Clark are kind of an interesting story there, but they explore that territory. If you ever go to St. Louis, the Arch is very fascinating. They have a really great museum there that goes into the Lewis and Clark expedition. Land parcels, because we have so much land, they're able to make them a little bit smaller, a little more affordable. They learned their lesson from the Northwest Ordinance in the Ohio River Valley. We got to be a little bit on guard from people who are land speculators. This will trigger another kind of Indian reaction with Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet. And so you're going to have kind of pan-Indianism playing a factor. Now, what you'll see is William Henry Harrison will come in and he will actually defeat Tecumseh and the Indian tribes. And it's a pan-Indian group, so it's a number of different tribes. He will actually defeat them in the Battle of Tippecanoe. And that's kind of important because one of the issues going into the War of 1812 is the perception that the British are encouraging Native Americans to resist the United States. And so this kind of factors into that a little bit. Again, this is another kind of sub-topic within this period of early 1800s history that we really don't have time to go into. But just know that you do have another attempt by Indian groups to kind of unify, get beyond their tribal differences, resist the United States. And it is to some extent, Great Britain's still in Canada. They're still hanging out in the Great Lakes region. They're not wanting to abandon some of those forts. And so that kind of encourages the Native Americans that maybe they can resist a little bit. And then William Henry Harrison wins very handily. Now, he will run for president later on, and it'll be Tippecanoe and Tyler too, I guess, so John Tyler is his vice president. William Henry Harrison will die very shortly after taking office. But just kind of know you will hear his name again. And this is where he gets his fame. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the politics of the 1800s. But just connect him with this particular period just before the War of 1812. Sorry, have to get a drink. World context. So Napoleon is basically going nuts in Europe. Of course, that's the unofficial version. Napoleon, you have this period in France after the French Revolution. You have a number of different factions in control of France. You have the French Republic. Very quickly, they try to invade Germany. Germany and Britain respond. They kind of end up pushing France back. You have a decade or so of kind of chaos within France where there's always this changing leadership. And into this steps Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte comes in and he kind of works his way up the military, he's a military genius, very young military guy. Works his way up, begins to lead successful battles against the British and against the Prussians, which Germany, right? At this point, it's not Germany, it's Prussia. So he's leading them, and he's being very successful. And he starts to conquer territory against Italy, against Spain, so he's claiming a lot of land, right? And over time, he will claim himself to be an emperor, the emperor of France, right? Kind of trying to hark back to the Roman Empire kind of days. Assertions of a French Empire, I think, are a bit exaggerated. I mean, France does have quite a bit of territory for a few years, but they don't hold on to it for very long. So from a global history perspective, I mean, empire, but he's definitely being aggressive in Europe, and you see, Great Britain, you see Prussia, all these Bavarian states that become Germany later on, Austria-Hungary. They're trying to resist France, essentially, and trying to keep France from getting control. And a lot of this has to do, I mean, you've got, colonial aspirations in there because you've got the Caribbean islands and the Sugar Islands, so that's factoring in. You've got control of the Mediterranean, North Africa, Egypt, that kind of thing. So in a nutshell, you have, and it's tempting to try to explain more of Napoleon. Napoleon really conquers a great deal of territory, gets defeated, and, tries to go into Russia, gets defeated, gets banished, then comes back and wins again, and then gets banished a second time. And so you have really kind of two waves of Napoleonic conquest. This is really involving the first wave. That's when he's most successful, rather. So this is before he tries to invade Russia and that kind of thing. Now that's coming, but at this juncture he hasn't done that yet. He's trying to solidify his control in Europe. And a big issue here, and we'll see this again when we get to World War I, is the notion of the freedom of the seas, that you've got Britain and France fighting each other, Britain with its incredibly strong navy that it's always had, since the period of exploration, right? I mean, we talked about how the Spanish Armada gets destroyed, and that leaves Britain with the main navy in the world. Well, that's still true when you get to, the early 1800s. And so Great Britain is trying to solidify its control over the seas, which means that they are basically stopping any ship they find. France is stopping ships. You've got the British coming in, and they're seizing ships. They're seizing the cargo. They're forcing the the sailors to go into the British Navy. And most Americans aren't real happy about this, okay? Then we also see another problem with Napoleon trying to shut off mainland Europe from Great Britain. So fine, Britain, if you're going to try to dominate the seas, then we're not going to let you trade at all with mainland Europe. And so you have kind of the system of, Britain and France arguing with each other. And I've got on here the Berlin and Milan decrees, the orders in council. At the end of the day, this has to do with Britain and France trying to control each other and deny each other resources, particularly resources from the Caribbean and from North America. Because North America, the United States, still has all the foodstuffs, all the agriculture, all the supplies that they've always had, right? So they're still there. People want our stuff. The problem is, how do we get our stuff? And Britain doesn't want France to have our stuff, and France doesn't want Britain to have our stuff. So you've got this whole issue going on. So the question is how can the United States maintain neutrality so we can trade with both Britain and France, and yet stop having our ships boarded by France and Britain, right? France won't let our ships in if we touch on a British port. If we try to go to a French port, then Britain, basically attacks our ships. And so how do we maintain neutrality? It's a very difficult situation. And this will kind of echo a little bit when we get to World War I as well. So Jefferson's first notion is, hey, let's have an embargo act. We're just going to not export to any other nations at all. Of course, keep in mind, Jefferson's, not always the most, pragmatic guy. I mean, obviously, this is a man who said life, liberty, pursuit of happiness while he has slaves. And so Jefferson says, well, fine, the United States has everything we need. We don't need to trade with foreign nations. And so he basically shuts off foreign trade with an act. Now, it's his idea. Congress does pass the law because Congress, the Democrat Republicans are in control. But what happens is it creates this major economic depression because remember, Hamilton's economic system is predicated on this international relationship with Great Britain. So all of a sudden we've shut that off, right? And all these manufacturers, all these merchants, all these, shippers are having trouble making any money. So you have this major problem. Plus, if we're doing that, like we are this agricultural society with sugar, and gradually at this point you're starting to see a little bit of cotton, and all of a sudden those exports don't have anywhere to go because we're not trading with anybody, right? And the whole idea that Jefferson has is that we're going to punish Great Britain and France for basically being, obnoxious, and we're just not going to trade with them. We're going to take our toys and go home, except we need them, right? So it causes major unemployment, prices, get out of whack, and everyone's super unhappy. Now, Jefferson will step down for the election of 1808. So he'd won 2 terms. He won in 1800, wins in 1804. So he gets to 1808. There's no law on the books that says he can only serve 2 terms, but he says he's going to honor Washington's tradition of only serving 2 terms. Maybe that's true. Maybe the Embargo Act was just so wildly unpopular that he knew the Democrat-Republicans were going to lose by a landslide if he attempted to run. Some of this has to do with the fact that he received a great deal of criticism for his relationship with Sally Hemings, so that had been kind of out there. Although it's interesting, he never actually acknowledges it. Like all these rumors, there's newspaper clippings and stuff about him, about his supposed relationship, and he never even looks at it. Anyway, so all that to say that he steps down, and so that's kind of where we see 1808 happening. You can see this is a political cartoon, an early one over an embargo. That's super fine sugar right there. You can see embargo is spelled backward. And the fact that you have to have these special licenses to trade your sugar with certain countries and that kind of thing. So basically being very, very critical of the embargo. James Madison, who's a Democrat-Republican, Jefferson stepped aside. So James Madison, the way's cleared for him because people are still a little unhappy about the Federalists, right? And you definitely see people are unhappy with, we don't want to shut down. People are definitely unhappy with the way Britain's treating the American ships and American sailors. So the Democrat-Republicans win, and James Madison's first thing is, we got to take care of this economy. We got to end this unemployment. We got to create some stability. So he attempts to do this, most notably with what he calls the Non-Intercourse Act, which means that we're going to trade with everybody but Britain and France. Well, except, Britain and France are the main ones we need to trade with. So that's not really great. You will see that later on, when that doesn't kind of turn the economy around, they try to basically reopen trade with Britain and France with the caveat that the president can refuse to trade if they violate neutrality. Okay, so basically, we're going to start trading with you, but if we get mad at you, we're going to stop, and we can stop whenever we want. So here Jefferson had said, we're going to take our toys and go home. We're not going to participate in all this craziness. And then the economy crashes because we're not participating with trade. And Madison comes in and he goes, well, okay, maybe we will participate in trade, but don't hurt our feelings or else, we're out of here again. That's not going to work super well. So the whole process of this, you really have a big factor in the buildup to the War of 1812 is going to be the fact that it takes forever to communicate, that communication gets in crossed seas, right? So you have Madison basically saying, okay, we're going to resume trade. Americans start resuming trade, and next thing you know, here are the British boarding American ships again, impressing American sailors, and everyone gets all upset, right? And so what will happen is that the United States will get very angry, and you basically have messages crossing on the open seas. Britain decides that, hey, we're going to go ahead and honor American neutrality. We're going to let that go. We're going to stop seizing ships because they realize that, probably the real result is that the embargo does hurt Great Britain. Now, it hurts the United States more, but Great Britain needs our stuff too. Remember, everyone needs all the wheat and corn and sugar and, tar and, wood for shipbuilding. Everyone needs all the stuff that we have. And so Britain probably needed that. And so they decided, okay, well, we will respect neutrality after all. However, by the time that message gets back to the United States, the Congress has already declared war on Great Britain because they've had it, up to here, and I'm motioning up to my head, with Great Britain kind of violating their neutrality. So you're going to have this whole issue. And another big issue that we have is the war hawks, right? And notice that war hawks always have a major role to play every time we go to war. There's always going to be a group of people that say, yeah, we need to fight, woohoo, that look back on the previous war, the previous generation, and say, yeah, what we really need is an opportunity to prove we're men. And you certainly had that with Henry Clay and some of these others that are looking, from the War of 1812. Now, these guys, many of them were born about the time of the French Revolution, or not French Revolution, American Revolution. But they were little, they were babies, or, some of them might have even been born a little bit after, and so that they didn't have a chance to participate, but they grew up with the stories of what the revolutionary soldiers had done. And so their idea is that, hey, we'll prove ourselves against Great Britain. And so basically the war hawks are calling for this. And I think that, certainly Great Britain's behavior had been pretty heavy-handed. Great Britain had never totally respected American independence. Yes, we were independent, but they always looked at us like we were kind of that wayward younger brother. And so, this issue with Indian unification efforts, that's kind of a persistent problem in addition to the impressment of soldiers and the attacking of American ships. And so there's that kind of sense of frustration that the British aren't taking us seriously. And so there is some justification. I don't want to make the war hawks sound like they were completely uncalled for. But there certainly are groups within the United States that are like, well, are we sure we really want to pick another fight with Great Britain? I mean, you're talking really just, 1783 to 1803 would be, 20 years? So you're talking roughly 30 years since the Revolutionary War. I mean, are we sure we want to go to war with them again? So, you kind of can see that some people might not like that, but I also think that many people felt like that was true. We also see that Americans are seeing this as an opportunity to really kind of step out and claim more territory. If you remember from the map of the Louisiana Purchase, right, you have Spanish Florida sitting there, and remember Spain had enticed slaves to run away as kind of a way to annoy first Great Britain and then later the United States. And Spain and Britain are allies, right, against France and against Napoleon. And so if we pick a fight with Great Britain, then we're also going to pick a fight with Spain. Now, I do want to clarify that you have a little bit of a lull here around 1812 with the Napoleonic Wars. So when I say that Britain is fighting the United States for the War of 1812, you have this brief period where Britain's not having to worry about Napoleon. This is one of the reasons why Britain is willing to kind of come after the United States in the War of 1812. This is one reason why they hadn't done so before, is because Napoleon had kept them pretty busy. And so there was no reason, they had to focus on France more than the United States. So you have this kind of lull after Napoleon kind of messes up and tries to invade Russia. And so when he kind of gets pushed back, you're going to see that this will allow Britain to kind of go back to, focusing on the United States and seeing if they can't maybe reclaim this territory. So these are the causes for the War of 1812. And I'm not really going to go into a whole lot of detail about the war, mostly because, again, there's just really not time. And at the end of the day, the key notions about the War of 1812 are the causes and the fact that it really kind of finalizes our separation with Great Britain. It's not so much the ins and outs of the battles, although I will mention, you can see here that, Jefferson had slashed federal spending, so you don't have a whole lot of money for any kind of national military. So this idea of the common defense, right? Jefferson's idea was we're going to rely on state militias. We're not going to rely on a standing army. So that hurts us. Every time the United States attempted to go on the attack and attack the British, it was a horrible failure. And they do manage to control the Great Lakes region, which of course is the area. This is where Tippecanoe comes in. And the fact that Harrison kind of gets control of that with the Indian population. Of course, that's pretty much on the interior of the country, so that's why Britain has a lot more trouble kind of defending that. Now, the British, because they have this great navy, right, they get direct access to Washington, D.C., so they march in, they burn Washington, D.C. down. This is when Dolly Madison famously rescues George Washington's portrait, and she and slaves in Washington in the White House basically round up all these items from the White House and save them. Matter of fact, she's one of the last people to leave Washington, D.C. after the British start to march on the city. So that's kind of an interesting side note in that. Andrew Jackson, this is when he first appears. He kind of had been fighting with the Creek, and I mentioned in the previous lecture that the Creek had faced annihilation in southern Georgia and what is now northern Florida. And that's largely due to Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, who we'll talk about him next week. He's kind of an interesting guy, and his attitude was, let's kill them all. And so he had been very successful in the Indian Wars against the Creek. And then we certainly see that against the British, he marches because he's in that southern area there around Georgia or whatever. The British had gotten control of New Orleans pretty quickly because of the Navy. He marches in, and he's gonna, let me rewind. They don't totally get control. They get the Navy to the port, and then he kind of launches this. They meet, and they kind of fight each other there. This is where that song, in 1814, we took a little trip with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. Remind me and I'll play it for you. But so anyways, Jackson meets the British, defeats them. Now the irony is that he actually defeats them in the Battle of New Orleans after the war is officially over. But again, this lag between communication means that he doesn't know that, right? So this is really kind of the last battle of the war. It is a victory for the United States, and it creates this huge kind of reputation for Andrew Jackson as this great general, all this kind of stuff. Now, understand he'd been fighting in Indian wars, that kind of thing, for some time. So you just kind of keep that in mind. And one thing I do want to point out, notice the Hartford Convention. This kind of, I mentioned the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions as a response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. And that the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions said, hey, we can nullify federal law if we disagree with it. So essentially the Hartford Convention is going to suggest that states can withdraw from the Union, right? That they can choose to, secede and make their own country. And the whole plan for the Hartford Convention, for these Federalists who are frustrated by the war with Britain, frustrated by the lack of trade, their notion is we'll immediately side with Great Britain and we'll become like a colony and we'll start making money again. But, what will happen is that most people, of course, by the time the Hartford Convention comes out, you're at the tail end of the war. The United States has managed to kind of hold its own. While we haven't had, particularly strong victories until, of course, the Battle of New Orleans, but you certainly see that the United States, like I said, it held its own. And to the Hartford Convention, most people are pretty appalled at the notion of states declaring their independence and seceding. And I think it's very telling since, it won't be very long. I mean, you're talking another 40 years, and you're going to have southern states talking about the same thing. Actually, less than that if you think about the nullification crisis of 1832. And so you're going to have southern states arguing that they can secede. Well, you see it happening at the Hartford Convention, and people kind of dismiss it. And this is what kills the Federalist Party. People look at the Federalists and say, clearly these people are nuts, right? They want to return back to British rule. They look at the Alien and Sedition Acts. Look at what they tried to do with Hartford, and so basically the Federalists will go away. The Treaty of Ghent will end the war, and so that is the official treaty that ends it. One last note about Andrew Jackson. He had actually been alive during the American Revolution. He was a young man, like a teenager. He actually served a great deal of time on a prison ship. When he was during the American Revolution, and then when he comes back, his mother is horribly ill and she dies. So he has a lot of bitterness towards the British. So one of the reasons why he's so like harsh when fighting the British in the War of 1812 is largely going to be that that he's kind of has a little more experience with, say, the American Revolution than some of them do. You can kind of see here, excuse me, what I mean by the British quickly get a blockade going. They control this Gulf Coast area. They kind of, slash and burn in the Washington, D.C. Americans are very successful up here. And then, of course, they're very successful down here around New Orleans. So the results of the War of 1812. Defense of the U.S., because once they stopped going on the attack so much and they started focusing on defending their territory, which is even mostly the case in New Orleans. I mean, you do have the British kind of exerting some influence in New Orleans before Jackson gets there, but largely it's meant to hold the British at bay. And so this allows the U.S. to be victorious, right? Holding on to the territory they already have. Great Britain after the War of 1812. Of course, part of this is due to the fact that Napoleon comes back. He starts exerting pressure in Europe again. So Britain's like, okay, fine. We can't deal with the United States anymore. We're going to focus on Napoleon. Let's just go to this trade relationship. That's what they wanted all along. That's where we work best. So very quickly, you have in 1815 a nearly free trade agreement between England, or with England and the British Empire. By 1817, we set the northern boundary of the United States. That's where we kind of have that line that separates Canada from the United States. And really, once Napoleon gets kicked out and once England finally accepts that, hey, the United States is going to be its own thing, we can't treat them like that annoying little brother. Instead, we have to kind of respect them a little bit as being independent. And as long as we do that, we can have this great business relationship with each other. We can start to view each other as equals. And then when Napoleon's out of the picture and, Great Britain's not bossing the U.S. around anymore, impressing our sailors and that kind of thing, really we don't have any more problems with England. And that kind of, you see this transition away from this tense relationship. So a lot of that has to do with England respecting our sovereignty and that kind of thing. And then, of course, the Indians are going to lose their last major ally. And really, after the War of 1812, by the time you get to 1814, 1815, most of the Indians in the Mississippi River Valley region are either being, assimilated, or they're being killed, or they're moving west. And so really you'll have kind of this period here where Indians are continually being overwhelmed by American settlement. Other things that we see with the War of 1812 is kind of the need for a stronger military. This is a lot of your military colleges will start to come from like the 1820s, that kind of thing. And that's from these guys that had fought in the War of 1812 and, realized, hey, maybe we do need to have some kind of military training. And the U.S. really focuses on business. Everything after the War of 1812, which is going to be over by 1814, right? Everything after that is going to be tied to the U.S. making money and being successful. And so really the next phase of the story for U.S. history is going to be about the development of kind of a modern economy, or maybe not modern, that's a little bit strong, a pre-modern economy. The factories, the manufacturing, the infrastructure that is going to make industrialization possible the farther into the 1800s that we get, which of course will reach its peak when you get to about 1890. So we'll start to see the U.S. investing in that. The Bank of the United States will be re-upped. And, of course, this is where Andrew Jackson will come in. So Andrew Jackson, whose story begins with the end of the War of 1812 and kind of solidifying his power in the Battle of New Orleans, solidifying his reputation, he will come to the presidency, and he will really kind of become, a force to be reckoned with, because he's going to be very much that kind of Jeffersonian Democrat, very much kind of that person that says, we believe in the small yeoman farmer. But there's a lot more complicated factors that go into that than just what's on the surface. So the big thing you need to take away is that the War of 1812 resolves our relationship with Great Britain, solidifies more territory for the United States, is really kind of the beginning of the end for Native American tribes and their kind of territorial claims. And we're going to just kind of see that the political party system, this is kind of the Federalists and the Hartford Convention will get rid of the Federalist Party. And so you'll have this brief period where we really only have one party. But that won't last forever. Eventually that will fade away, and we'll see the emergence of the party system. And it's the second party system that emerges by 1824 that is really more connected to the political parties that we're familiar with today. So that's it in a nutshell. I hope that made some sense. I talked awfully quickly. And so next week we will be picking up with after the War of 1812 and the economic factors. And then we'll get to talk about Andrew Jackson, one of my least favorite people. All right. Thank you very much.